This Sunday addresses a cautionary tale about the high cost of choosing the wrong friends. There's no good guys or bad guys in this story, but there is a winner and a loser. As Black Americans, we're constantly upbraided and insulted, ironically enough, by Africans in Africa and even inside the US, who tell us that we don't work hard and their African culture has made them successful in America. Now, of course, this is a gross exaggeration on their part, but it does beg the question. If the Africans have a superior work ethic, then shouldn't we be seeing the results in the place that has the highest concentration of Africans on Earth? That is, Africa. I don't know if they've heard, but China is holding over $100 billion in debt over Africa's heads. And just for the record, the second largest amount of African debt China owns is in Ethiopia. That's important because a few years ago, you'll recall that back in June of 2020, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said that Black Americans are to blame for our oppression, that we failed to take advantage of the opportunities the U.S. offers. He said that immigrants have surpassed Black Americans because we just don't try. Now, this guy wants to talk about people who failed. He can start by looking at home. At the very same time that he was insulting Black Americans for not doing anything to help ourselves, his own citizens were fleeing Ethiopia. Just a few months after he called us failures, his own citizens began fleeing the country that he is in charge of. Actually, the problem started long before that, but his behavior in the face of these mounting crises shows why Ethiopia is in the shape it's in, and his attitude of refusing to solve his country's problems and instead choosing to deflect onto people who don't even live in Ethiopia is actually at the heart of so much of Africa's failed leadership. Why has Ethiopia's historical problems of famine, war, and pestilence not been solved or even addressed? Because of Abiy Ahmed and the mentality that he espouses. The corrupt Ethiopian prime minister has failed to build up his country. He's decided to outsource that to China. Talking trash about Black Americans is easy, especially when you're doing it from the other side of the world, but building a country is hard. Apparently far too hard for Abiy Ahmed to do. This guy has no victories that he can point to, none at all. In fact, Ethiopia is in worse shape now than it was when he first took office. I could see it differently, though, if he was alone, but this attitude of disrespect that he shows is also prevalent in a lot of the immigrants who come from Africa to the U.S. Dumping on Black Americans is a defense mechanism used to cover their own embarrassment. It makes them feel less depressed about the fact that they had to leave where they came from just to make it. And of course, the majority of these African immigrants, when they come to the United States, they try to identify themselves as immigrants primarily, as if being Black means absolutely nothing to them at all. Now, this problem becomes worse when they try to extend it to other groups around the world. A lot of Black people have convinced themselves that they have friends in places that they don't. For the longest time, African governments and a lot of their people have tried to get by on other countries' contributions. They ride the coattails of what Black Americans have done, or they seek money from foreign governments. But without building anything, at some point, what invariably happens is that their citizens flee, and then they resort to trying to make themselves feel better about it by claiming they're so hardworking. This is cope. Well, China's been giving Africa billions of dollars allegedly for the Belt and Road scheme, but as a lot of Black Americans have been pointing out for years, the Chinese are racist towards Black people all over the world. This, however, flew in one ear and out the other for practically all the Africans who heard this warning. China has pulled the same scam the Europeans did, claiming that they were going to develop Africa, when in reality all they did was build a few small infrastructure projects that would simply make it easier for Chinese companies to extract Africa's resources. They weren't building a transcontinental or even a transnational highway system there. They were simply building a single one-lane highway north by northeast. But the Chinese did one better, or rather worse than the Europeans. These Chinese not only built very minor infrastructure solely for the purpose of expediting their own exploitation of Africa, but they made the Africans pay them for it. And worse than that, they made it a debt trap, one that they're not letting the Africans out of. The Chinese literally sold Africa the rope they intend to hang them with. Meanwhile, the Chinese nationals who have been coming into Africa have been building their own separate little enclaves, and just to show who's in charge, they've been abusing the Africans economically, verbally, and even physically. In China, they publicly put on little displays where they show Africans as being compared to animals, and what has the African reprisal been for this blatant racism? To give the Chinese more land and more resources. In Africa, the Chinese are telling the Africans the reason that they're poor is because they don't work hard, that they blame the IMF for their failures, that they blame European empires that collapsed decades ago. When will the African take responsibility for his situation, the Chinese say? And how has the African responded to this disrespect? Mainly to capitulate. Africa's leaders all have a few things in common. They all have foreign bank accounts, most of them prefer to spend their time outside of Africa, and they found out a long time ago that if they told their people that they were better than Black Americans, then their people would allow themselves to be ripped off for a few more years. I say these things because this is the situation that African migrants are coming out of when they come to the United States. While there have been some bona fide down-for-the-struggle riders here, and they need to be mentioned, the reality is the majority of African immigrants have been economic immigrants, and in most cases, they were either collaborators with the corrupt leaders of their countries, or they were also looking to sell out to the highest bidder. Too many Negroes from abroad have tried to hide their embarrassment of failing to build up their homes behind a cloak of phony bravado, and that usually takes the form of insulting Black Americans. Now, let's put aside for a moment that the majority of African and Caribbean immigrants are not killing the game when it comes to business ownership. I know that's a popular trope, but it's still just a trope. You have a lot of people who get into university jobs or middle management in some white corporation, but what you don't have is any rabid entrepreneurship going on among that group. What you see is that they come to the United States and that they're able to immediately access and enjoy the opportunities that we made possible. And clearly the work that we put in was the secret sauce, because for all their hard work and alleged superior culture and education, they were not able to duplicate the success they've had in the U.S. anywhere else. Africa's tried to boast the last 15 years about hydroelectric power dams and highway and infrastructure projects, but so far, almost none of them have actually materialized. What's going on in Africa is that they're showing what little economic activity a number of these countries had was being done on China's dime, and when China pulls the plug on it, the so-called activity will stop. And when you look at how Africans are fleeing these countries, you understand that what little building is going on there isn't nearly enough. They don't have the luxury of trying to distract themselves from this reality by attacking us, but that's what they've chosen to do. There is a very real danger in not admitting to the reality of one's situation. When the Africans decided to run from the responsibility of building up home, they opened the door for the Chinese to exploit them. For years, a lot of Black Americans have been warning that the racism we've encountered from Chinese nationals in the U.S. is a microcosm of what would occur in Africa when Beijing got its hooks into the place. We were scoffed at, told that the Africans have the situation totally under control, and that we as Black Americans needed to mind our own business. Now, some people are trying to put a pretty face on this economic colonization by saying that China needs money and the Africans don't have it, and China wants to maintain its economic control of these places without losing its facade of being a friendly alternative to American hegemony in these third world countries. Well, they're wrong. Look at what the Chinese government did in Tibet, and what Chinese nationals have done in the Philippines. Look at what many of them are doing in Africa right now. I don't see any concern on China's part for how they're perceived. In fact, I see the same callousness that the Chinese government shows towards its own people when it comes to building new real estate developments and the like. Now, if they brutally crack down on their own people for getting in the way of the government's economic agenda, what do you think they'll do in a faraway land where there's no real media infrastructure to expose them and who the rest of the world doesn't care about? As I explained in my classic video series about how racist China is towards Black people, it's not on this channel, but you can probably still find it on YouTube. China desperately needs resources, land for its people, and minerals and raw materials for its home industries. China has the opposite problem that Saudi Arabia has. The Saudis have the resources, but they don't control the means of production. China controls the means of production, but they don't have their own resources, certainly not enough for over 1 billion people. And now we see China calling a number of these debts in Africa due. And the Africans don't have the ability to satisfy any of these debts. They're begging for loan forgiveness across the board. Now, when a debtor can't pay their creditor, what happens? The creditor doesn't just sulk off into a corner. The creditor seizes all the debtor's assets. So to China, Africa's land and natural resources is the perfect collateral to seize. And as Beijing has shown, once they get their hooks into a place, it's incredibly difficult to dislodge them. And how is Africa going to deter China from running roughshod over them? Military force is certainly out of the question. The white media's narrative that the Chinese don't want to antagonize the Africans by being too belligerent, that's a face-saving lie that echoes the concerns of established white power. Their narrative is that the Africans are ultra-hypersensitive to anything that even looks like neo-colonialism. But that's largely a paper tiger. The Africans have called a lot of things neo-colonialism, like the U.S. military's AFRICOM command. But they haven't actually done anything about these colonizers other than give some speeches. Well, China doesn't care about tough talk. They only care about what people will actually do. The Chinese already know that being inhumane towards the Africans has not resulted in them being forced out. And this reluctance to act on the part of Africa has now emboldened China. China doesn't really have much of an incentive to be friendly to the Africans since the continent's leaders largely don't live there and have shown that they don't really care what happens to the people anyway. You have leaders who live in Europe, citizens who are fleeing. As China sees it, nobody's minding the store. And China's track record shows they much prefer taking things by force as opposed to having to buy them. Keeping Africa poor also means Africa will be easy to control. Beijing has no interest in a strong Africa, because a strong Africa will charge more for its resources and also will be in a position where they don't have to tolerate any disrespect. Well, actually, given their track record, there's no promise that Africa will stop tolerating China's disrespect, but I'm trying to keep my fingers crossed on that one. The lesson here is reality always gets the last word. When the Ethiopian Prime Minister attacked Black Americans, it says a lot that he wasn't challenged by his own governmental peers or anyone else there. You know why you don't see Black American leaders comparing themselves to failed states in Africa? Not just because their constituents wouldn't tolerate a black person in the U.S. attacking other black people abroad, but also because we recognize attacking other poor black people does nothing to help us meet our own basic needs. Unfortunately, it looks like more than a few Africans think that it does. Braggarts don't build, and builders don't brag, at least not until they've actually built something. What China is doing in Africa is tragic, but it's also totally foreseeable. As Black Americans, we've been warning about it for many years now. We told the Africans for the longest time that they need to extend an open, unobstructed invitation to Black Americans to get Africa back on its feet. They roll out the welcome wagon for everyone else. It's just common sense that they should at least be open to the idea of giving more than lip service to the only group of people on the planet who simply want to help Africa and nothing else. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that this habitual need that so many Africans have to disrespect Black Americans is closely tied to their utter, adamant hostility toward Black Americans coming to Africa and building. After having insulted us for so long, could they really live with the embarrassment of seeing us do what they couldn't? No matter what they tell themselves, when it comes to Black achievement, the world looks to Black Americans. People like Akon and others keep talking about what they're going to do for Africa, but nothing actually materializes. It's a bad case, I suppose, of preferring to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Except with China's growing encroachment, they won't have a heaven or a hell, but rather nothing. Beijing has no plans to do Africa any favors. It's unfortunate because it was all so unnecessary. It didn't have to go this way. But Africa chose for it to go this way. There's a harsh reality that the last remnants of the Pan-African advocates will have to accept, whether they want to or not. Pan-Africanism could never have been made to work for the same reason these damned-to-die-aborning alliances so many Black Americans chase after in the U.S. have never worked. We want it more than they do. As Black Americans, we have had to persevere against the greatest odds, and we're still fighting. We breathe new life and new meaning into the veins of human civilization. The result is that even in our oppressed condition, we never allowed the forces of anti-Black racism to rob us of our optimism, to rob us of our ability to hope. But hope becomes delusion if it's not tempered with a solid realism about the world and the people in it. We decided for a long time to tell ourselves that because we wanted something, that meant that everyone else more or less would want the same thing. They would see the value in it. We didn't want to accept that this simply wasn't true. A lot of people are not looking to overthrow white supremacy. They're just trying to find a comfortable place under it. And instead of fighting it, they're looking for any excuse to flee from the fight. We're not built that way, but we have to accept that a majority of people are. And what they're waiting on is for us to do the heavy lifting once again, because we've been doing it for the last 150 years. And they think what they're going to do is show up after the fact and enjoy the spoils of the fights that we waged and that we won. and that they would enjoy the benefits. This has been the pattern for the last 150 years, and it's gotten especially bad in the last 50 or so. Obviously, I'm not cheering for China. They have no one's best interest at heart at all. But that essential fire of self-confidence and refusal to be dependent on anyone else, which every nation needs just in order to survive, is missing in Africa. Coming to the U.S. and blustering that they're successful immigrants is no substitute for the group's success that has eluded them at home. And for corrupt and failed misleaders like Ahmed to attack us hasn't filled the bellies of his people, and it won't pay Ethiopia's bills either. The Africans sold the continent's birthright. And now the people they sold it to are here to collect. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Richard Griffith, Keith Baker, Quincy X, Philander Bryant, and Kimba Shakur. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.